Okay, shall we start?
Let's go.
All right, let's do it.
Art is inherently not efficient. Innovation is fundamentally terribly inefficient because you're making mistakes. That kind of inefficiency is actually what we're good at. And that's where we're going to drift as we take anything that is efficient and give them to the bots. I want to make a magazine that feels like it got mailed back from the future. I said, okay, I am on board for that. Wired was about the culture of technology rather than the technology itself. The real opportunity for entrepreneurs today, right now, this minute, is to take something and add AI to it and make something new. The currency in the VR world and economy will be experiences rather than knowledge or information. If you want an answer, you ask a machine these days. If you want a question, this is what humans are really good at, and making a good question is much more valuable than a good answer.
Our guest this week has pretty much been there and done that. Whether that means founding Wired Magazine back in the early 90s or now writing books about the future that are extremely relevant when it comes to artificial intelligence and robotics, Kevin Kelly has always been on the leading edge of producing ideas and content, and this interview is no exception. His article, 1,000 True Fans, is something that I've based London Real on and much of our entire Business Accelerator program, and it's an amazing concept. And Kevin is constantly producing great ideas, and I just love spending the time with him that we did. He talks about some big concepts, as in why he created Wired Magazine and how at the time he knew that there should be a magazine to talk about this internet thing, because he knew it was going to be a cultural piece, a piece for social change, and that they needed to grab it. And he talks us through the entire really painful history of what happened to Wired. It was taken over and how it kind of lost its way when it came from a business and an editorial standpoint. And he also gave me a little bit of advice, which was to have more children. He said they're all a blessing and I should have 5. So Kevin, thanks so much for that. I've passed that on to Mariana. We might be taking your advice there, but I think you're really going to enjoy this very much with Kevin Kelly. It's been a really fun week here on the Academy at London Real. People have been posting their cold shower videos all inside of the new Academy, including myself. So you got a bunch of naked people jumping into cold water, and it's all part of one of our body and mind challenges. The theory is if you get uncomfortable a little bit during your week, it might have a greater onset to other parts of your life, and it's a ton of fun. So lots of good stuff happening inside the new Academy, and now I'm going to leave you with Mr. Kevin Kelly. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Kevin Kelly, the founding executive editor of Wired Magazine. You are a writer, photographer, conservationist, and student of Asian and digital culture. Your latest book, The Inevitable: Understanding the 12 Technological Forces That Will Shape Our Future, is out. The praise for the book has been incredible, with venture capitalist Mark Andreessen saying it's an automatic must-read. Kevin, welcome to London Real.
It's really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. I'm curious, before we jump in, London as a town, have you had a relationship with it over the years, or when you're in Asia or in California and you think about London or the Brits, what comes to mind?
Oh my gosh. I think my memory of London is actually a scene that I saw this afternoon walking here, which is Friday afternoon in front of every pub outside are throngs of people hanging out drinking beer. That's my image of London.
Yeah, that's a funny image because in the summer here, the pubs just kind of overflow. And there's glasses everywhere.
And they're on the street, and they're drinking.
Yeah. It's so funny because when I was 15 years old, I took a train here on like the Eurostar Pass back in the day. And I remember I saw someone drinking a beer in the middle of the day at a train station. And for me, that was such a strange piece.
Exactly.
And so I don't know what it says about Britain, but I think it's quite a good time. This is the summer, it comes out, and a lot happens in the pub here.
Yeah,
you know? It used to be a public house where people would just go and talk, and it's kind of got a warm place.
Right. So there is this sort of camaraderie that is on exhibit here, of a kind of a very tight social knitting. I think that is reflected on the outside the pub. The other thing that I get from London is. I was a photographer. I liked to look at things. And photography for me is an excuse to force me to look. And as I walk around the city, the thing that I'm kind of amazed by or I don't know, enthused by is the 1,000 details. Architectural, artistic, environmental that have been made over thousands of years of city life, where you build up this very large, dense network of little things that make life good. And so you walk down the street and there's things put there, standing there, that have been there for a long time, and it's sort of like an ongoing art piece. It's like a masterpiece work. The city itself, if its infrastructure has accumulated the best of, so the things that don't work are kind of forgotten, things that do work people give care to and they are maintained. So you have this kind of like, I was imagining it, if this was a VR world, the amount of hours that you would have to spend to recreate it. And here it is, it's this incredible VR experience. You get to walk through and they have all these amazing details that somebody has spent their lifetime kind of making work. The iron work, the tiles on the floor, the eaves of a roof, the gargoyles, all this stuff is amazing. I'm just thinking, like, if this was a video game, it would be very expensive. But I get to walk through this for free.
Yeah, it's almost like we're almost the hoarders of history. And
exactly.
We've kept all this stuff and it's just in the attic.
Right.
And everything has a story, and you'll see a lamp that used to be a gas lamp.
Right.
No longer is, but that's why it's shaped that way.
Right.
And I know you just came from speaking at an institution right around here. You would have walked by the old walled city of London.
Exactly.
And you would have seen all these different incarnations of this wall that now doesn't mean anything, but it does mean something. Right.
And it's like, I mean, there's just little things, a doorknob, the kind of etched glass in the window of a pub. There are all these little tiny details that have a lot of care, a lot of love, a lot of time, a lot of expense to put there, and yet there is this sort of, they're being shared. It's the commonwealth. Right. And so the city itself is an experience that rewards you just to walk through. And the great cities of the world have that aspect, the attribute, where everywhere you look, you're seeing something that has been refined in some way. And then the other thing, London, that surprised me is that this is as crowded with people as Hong Kong. Especially in the summertime, this is incredibly dense with life and people doing everything, going around. A lot of them are tourists, but a lot are natives. And there's just this vibrancy that makes this experience of going through it really, really enjoyable.
Yeah, and that population density, I think it's where great ideas are created and great companies are created. And we have a technology show here as well called Silicon Reel, and I've interviewed, say, 90 of the top founders and CEOs in London tech, and it all happened. They got ideas for their company when they were all in the same room, sometimes sharing a beverage, and it didn't happen over Skype. It happened when all these people, and I think you get them in this physical proximity, and that's where things happen, right?
Right, and that's why there's this mass migration around the world of people moving into cities. This urbanization is because cities are technology. Cities are the biggest, most complex technology that we humans have made. And their function is to allow this serendipical contact, this associations, this discovery of having high density, sufficient density to actually have these ideas spring and communicate, and also to have the market, the audience for the things that you're doing. And we're headed in the world to even more dense, larger cities, while basically the villages are emptying. And that's true not just in China and India, but even in England, where a lot of the villages are sort of more museums than they are thriving places, because the people, particularly the young, those are the most industrious, have moved to the cities. And the cities have the lowest, actually, environmental footprint of anything per capita. So environmentally, it's actually what we want. We actually want to have these very dense, vibrant cities, and then we want to have a very green rest of the world out there, including wilderness. And that's the vision of a city, which are these nodes of innovation, nodes of wealth, nodes of community that are just optimized for this thing that we really enjoy and derive our progress from.
That's fascinating. And why is that accelerating? Is it because those young people, do they crave those new ideas, or for them they see their most upside intellectually just to go to those places?
What cities provide more than anything else is choices, opportunities. You know, I mean, okay, so you have people buying one-way tickets from a beautiful village with beautiful wooden houses in China or on some Greek island, and they're moving to the city because while they're leaving behind very strong families, organic food, a beautiful architecture that's suited to the geography, strong family ties, a real sense of who they are, they're moving to the city because they have more choices than they do in a village. They have more options. They can be a ballerina, they could study mathematics, they could eat a hamburger if they wanted to. And so people are moving to the cities because what cities deliver are choices and opportunities.
It's like the internet of humanity.
It is.
You can go to whatever site
exactly.
you want.
It's the internet of things, and we call that a city.
Right. That's fascinating. I want to jump into everything in Asia as well. We were briefly chatting about content, and I figured we should talk about Wired very quickly here, and how you said, you know, when Wired started, it really was a lot about this long form content where people could kind of open up ideas. Can you take me back to, you know, you founding that and what was going on at the time, and and since?
Well, so I been before Wired. I was publishing and editing first, and then publishing a magazine that we would now look back on and say, oh, it was user-generated content, and it was completely user-supported. There were no ads. It was all subscriptions. And we would publish it really fast on newsprint, which was as fast as we could do it, so it was really cheap. And we would distribute it by mail. And so what it was the internet on newsprint.
Okay.
It was the web on newsprint. And if you go back and read those issues, they still have that same flavor, and they're still evergreen. They still make sense. They're not fashionable. They're kind of perennial in that sense.
Like printed blogs, is what
exactly. They feel and smell like a blog. They have that same enthusiastic, passionate voice that we would recognize on the blog sphere.
And that's in the 80s.
This is in the 70s and 80s. I came in the 80s to run it.
Okay.
And at the same moment was the very beginning of the online world. And Whole Earth was involved, the editors were involved in an experimental online community, one of the very first, run out by the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Okay. And I got invited on there because I was starting to write about travel. I was a traveler. And I viewed well, we didn't call it the internet. I viewed the online world as if it was a separate new country. And I was a travel writer, and I was going to report on this new country that was emerging online. We crawled in through the little plug, the telephone plug, and there was this Alice in Wonderland of this new place. And I got invited onto this other experimental one as part of that research, and my mind was blown. It was like, this vision of technology is a different vision than what us old hippies had been afraid of the steamrolling, the chemical plants, the smokestacks, the big supercomputers that controlled your life. And this was a very different organic feel to it. It felt more human skills, felt more biological, being connected with people, connecting with other people. And so we kind of decided to try and do that, we being Whole ourselves. So we got involved in starting a own online service. You had to dial up with your phone. It was a local call, it was a long distance call if you weren't local. And that was the very beginning, but we quickly tried to mesh onto this emerging internet, and eventually we became the first public access to the internet that anybody could get onto. Before that time, you had to be, this would be in like 1984, you had to be in a company or a university,
right, okay,
to be able to get on the internet. We decided, no, anybody could come on if they paid us $8 a month, which was considered at that time a really good deal, to get onto the internet, whatever that was. We didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what it was. And so that's what we were involved in. And that was when I first started becoming really interested in technology was in 1985 or so. I also organized the first hackers conference, and hacker in the good sense of people who were making these networks.
Okay. Now the movie War Games came out in '84.
Right.
And they kind of gave hacker the
bad name, which is the people who were kind of trying to bring down this thing. There was another version from MIT, the MIT Model Railway Club, who used hacker in a positive sense of trying to find out how something works and maybe tweak it a little bit.
Okay. So you took that version.
We took that version of hackers, and we invited 3 generations of these guys, mostly guys, to come to California, and they would meet each other for the first time. They had never met. This was pre-internet, basically. And so I became much more interested in kind of the human side and the biological likeness of technology that was shown to me by the online world. And eventually we brought that to Wired because it seemed to me that that was going to, that was a big enough or a potent enough force that was going to affect many aspects of our life. And that came from 5 years of living online.
Okay.
So my years of living online taught me many, many things. And so by the time that 1990 came around, I was convinced that this was going to stick and it was really going to affect things. What I had seen of living online for 5 years, seeing how people behave, seeing what they did, seeing how it changed things, what it facilitated, I was convinced that this was really the best, most powerful thing since, writing or the printing press. And the other founders of Wired believed the same thing. And so we wanted to make a magazine that would kind of report on that in a certain sense, because 1990, nobody was paying attention to this. I mean, there was computer magazines that talked about what computer to buy, but I mean, if you saw them now, you'd laugh because they were so
hardware focused.
Hardware focused,
right?
Bits and baud and
not culture.
Not at all.
Okay.
And
that's what Wired was all about.
Wired was about the culture of technology rather than the technology itself.
Right. That's fascinating. And that was based in San Francisco, so based on the West Coast. Can you give me a perspective of the West Coast, of Silicon Valley, of why it happened there? In London, in the tech space, which is right around here, you're actually in the middle of tech, because it started off as kind of a low rent district, and now it's next to the banks, and fintech is big. But everyone compares themselves to the Valley. Mm-hmm. I was curious if you could give me your take on why the Valley happened in the Valley, and California and that whole area.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because by all rights, Silicon Valley should have happened around Boston.
Okay.
There was Route 128, which surrounded Boston, and it was where all the early computer companies were.
Right.
There was, DEC.
DEC was there.
Sperry Rand. I mean, there was just
from the institutions.
They were mostly coming out of the colleges.
Right.
Boston being a big, huge university nexus. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of high caliber universities that had really smart people who were working on computer science and all this stuff. and they had an early lead. There was around Route 28, this kind of ring road around Boston, Cambridge, where they were settled. It was kind of like that Silicon Valley. And so the question was why didn't it happen there? Why did it happen in Silicon Valley? There was actually a book written about this that tried to explain the competitive advantage that each had. And as far as I can tell, there were many reasons, but a couple of the central reasons was that Silicon Valley, which was around Stanford, was so far away from the axis of funding by the US government that it wasn't getting any.
Right.
Okay? So a lot of the funding for this kind of computer stuff was coming from, directly or indirectly, from the government. But Stanford was just like too far away, it was too new, it was not getting that. And so they started to rely on private funding. They developed the VC invention. They invented VCs, basically, this kind of really fast private investment.
Out of necessity.
Out of necessity. So one of the ways we say is that one of the best inventions of Silicon Valley is actually Silicon Valley investment. Right? That was the most powerful meta invention. And so that's one reason. And the other reason is because I think this was a residue, a little bit, of the history of California, which in 1949 there was a 1849 there was the 49ers who came out. Yeah. And so what they were doing was there was like, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of young men coming out. And the United States was very unique in the sense that its gold fields were not claimed by the government. Everywhere else in the world, the gold was claimed by the ruling government. The United States said anybody could claim this. So you had people rushing in.
Was that a tactic to get California populated, or did they just miss the boat?
I think it was, yes, it was a tactic to get it populated. Okay. But what the effect of was that you had all these people coming in who had no adult supervision, no one to say no to.
Just like Silicon Valley.
Exactly. And so you had them, then you had the Bohemians afterwards, and then you had the beatniks, and then you had the hippies, and this was all just the same continuation of this sort of no adult supervision, no permission being asked, and you had this culture of people, as we were saying, asking for forgiveness later, not asking for permission to start with. And so I think that was also the essential ingredient, was a continuation of basically the California gold rush mentality of people who didn't want to work for a boss, people who wanted to do their own things, people who wanted to start something and then ask forgiveness if they had to later on.
Right, an entrepreneurial spirit.
Exactly.
It's funny because I was just telling you I graduated MIT in '93, but there was no business spin put on anything when I was there. There was even no talk of it really. Now I got lucky and I took some classes at the Sloan School, which is a great business school, but we were never talked about business, and I get the feeling that if I'd gotten that same degree at Stanford, I would have been inundated either in the class or outside the class, or been surrounded by people starting businesses. And it's almost boggles my mind because the number of startups coming from Stanford versus MIT, I mean, I don't know, but it must be 10 to 1, which is...
Well, actually, these days, kids are having trouble graduating because they're usually snatched up before they even graduate, and it's really infuriating to the professors because they don't get to claim any graduates. But I have 3 kids that are kind of millennials, and what's interesting to me about them is that they're all basically involved in startups, and all their friends are involved in startups. I mean, it's like that is the preferred mode for a young person today, and I have to remind them that it was really very different. When I was growing up, if someone told you that they were involved in a startup, that was code for they were unemployed. This was like the lowest ranking you could get to. Was you were involved in a startup, was like, he doesn't have a job, and everybody wanted to work for the big companies. And this was sort of like, you were desperate if you were doing your own startup. That had no dignity, there was no status whatsoever. And that has completely flipped now. Now it's just like, oh, this is the thing, and if you're kind of like desperate, you're going to work for Google or IBM or somebody like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that's changed, and even the culture. I always say in the '70s, if you were really going after it, you would go to the oil, and in the '80s you might go to Wall Street, and then nowadays, like you said, not only would you go into technology, but you'd go into the startup, not into the corporations.
Right. Yeah.
You've said before that you have no interest in being a billionaire. And yet, in the Valley and in San Francisco, I would argue that most of these millennials do aspire to that.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that culture, kind of even the media culture of the startup, of the billionaire. You know, it's this very strange story of a very few that pervades the media.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that's silly. I mean, I might not be interested because I've seen enough billionaires and hung around enough for them to understand what a burden that is to actually have $1 billion. I also think that there's a huge difference in making a living versus making a fortune. And making a living is actually maybe not as epic as making a fortune, but is a lot more reasonable for most people to even shoot for. But oftentimes in the VC world, what they call lifestyle businesses are completely looked down upon, which is basically means you can make a living, but you're not going to make a fortune. What the VCs want is they want scaling. They want something that was a scale. But this is like, this is really unnecessary for most people, and it's very unlikely for most of them. And I think the idea of always trying to shoot for it is really misguided. It goes back to my thesis of 1,000 true fans, which is you don't need 1 million fans to actually make a living. You can get by with a much smaller, many orders of magnitude smaller number of supporters of an audience or fans or customers, whatever you want. And so I'm arguing that there's one thing that I don't like about Silicon Valley is this misplaced attention to this huge scaling up, which does work, can be amazing, but it isn't necessary. There's many other options, and I think it's a little distracting for those young people who are always shooting for that, whereas they would do much better to try and make something that's of value that they can really sell, that works now, and then they can grow it organically and make it a little bigger. But I don't know, it's really hard to counsel somebody young and to tell them, lower your sights, try something a little bit more reasonable. But I think part of it might be role models, right? So you have the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs and all these people who were successful at that scale. And I think what I would like to see is more people who have, we call them lifestyle businesses, but who have fortunes, who have livelihoods rather than fortunes, that are form a role model for young people and say, yeah, that's what I would like to try and do, something like that.
When you say the burden of $1 billion, can you explain that? Because you probably met more billionaires than most people.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, here's what happens when you have $1 billion. That's just 1 billion, and so now, not even to mention 10 billion or 20 billion, which some of these folks have, is that you have, it begins to take over your life in the sense that you have to do something with that. Either you have to manage it to make more billions, or you have to give it away. And giving it away is actually difficult. To give it away responsibly is incredibly difficult. This is why Warren Buffett basically punted and decided, Bill Gates is going to give away my billions because I can't do it.
He outsourced it.
He outsourced it because it's a really difficult problem. And it takes over your life in many ways. Because if you have $1 billion, you can't spend it all as a normal human being. And if you meet a billionaire, they're going to be wearing basically the same clothes as a millionaire, right? They're going to be driving the same car as a millionaire. They're going to have basically the same house as a millionaire or a multimillionaire. They don't have 1,000 times more house. They don't have 1,000 times better clothes. Okay, so spending it is actually difficult. And so what happens is you have to you start to have to spend an immense amount of time to do something with it, and you have to build an organization to give it away. You just can't give it away. You have to have people involved, and soon that organization is consuming a lot of what you're trying to give away, and so you have to balance this around. It becomes a job. In every case, it becomes a job. And so that, to do well at it, because who wants not to do well, shifts a lot of their life and their attention to that thing, dealing with that thing. And it's a burden in the sense that you have a they all of them feel some responsibility to do something with it, something good. And it's so large that it consumes a lot of their attention.
Okay. Is it also true sometimes, and I don't want to generalize, that
Yeah.
if you've gotten that $1 billion or $2, that you're probably maybe very competitive, you maybe have a lot of issues maybe you're personally dealing with to try to, that forces you to kind of get bigger and go bigger, because many people would have cooled off at 10, 100 million. So do you think personality types, sometimes these billionaires are still constantly looking for the next thing?
Actually, not always. I mean, some of the billionaires I've met have been very, have not been extreme in that sense. But I will say one thing is that I think greatness is overrated. Greatness is basically, you have to be extreme in some fashion to be called great, really great, world-class great, by the rest of your society. So there is something that you're giving up for that, but not all the billionaires that I know are actually sort of super competitive in that sense. They're competitive enough, believe me, but they're not I would call abnormal or pathological in that sense. Some are keep going because they see they want to use this wealth for some good. They have some objective. They're trying to do something, or their own company, which they fervently believe in, is serving people. And like a Jeff Bezos truly believes that he is serving humanity by having really low prices on anything you can buy. He says, that's to him is like good.
Yeah.
That's good for the world. Is why not have affordable things for everybody? And so he's sort of driven by really trying to genuinely serve people that way.
Yeah, and his obsession with that, you could argue, does a lot of good things.
Right.
And Jeff Bezos and email, you always have thoughts about Jeff and his email box.
Well, yeah, I tell the story that, in fact, I think I heard him say recently, repeated the same thing, which is that I'm always really interested in how people manage their email, particularly as they become either famous or sought after in some ways. And his method, I guess you would say, is that he has a fairly public address, and if you write to him, he will see it, but he will very rarely respond to it because he has more than one assistant who's also getting all his mail, and that person will act on that piece of mail if it needs any action or if Jeff has directed it. And so the worst case is that Jeff will also independently act on it. So a person may get 2 responses if they get any response, and he says no one's ever complained about getting 2 responses from him and his assistant. So he just basically lets the assistants take care of it, and he's reading everything, but only responding to those that he wants to respond to. So nothing is left falling into the cracks, and sometimes he gets to respond directly.
Okay, so that's a good way to kind of go if you get famous.
And it seems to work for him.
Right, it seems to work for him. The 1,000 True Fans article.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing piece of work. Right. I've quoted it so many times to so many people on this show. It's not even funny. When did you write that? And did you have any idea how it was going to, reverberate around the world?
That's a good question.
It's not a long piece.
No, it's not. And so actually, I had been talking about it for a couple of years before that. I was just sort of playing out the math, the arithmetic, which is mostly all it is. It's just kind of an exploration of the math. And I mean, I would, when I would meet people from the music industry, I would kind of inquire to them about some of the independent artists, trying to see if there's any evidence for this idea. And so after a couple of years, I decided that I didn't have enough answers or evidence, and that I would just write it up, basically asking people if they had any ideas. And part of this was also trying to suggest ways in which those would be funded, because this was long before Kickstarter. And I was trying to also research to see whether there was, economic or funding models that would work for somebody. And so I finally kind of just decided I was going to do this, and I put it out saying, basically, does anybody know anybody who's actually doing this, and how are they doing it? And that was the impetus to write it down. And then I did a couple follow-ups because I heard back from people who knew people who were doing it or trying it, and people who were trying to start these funding sites to make that happen. So it was several years in gestation, and no, I had no clue that it was going to, work. That's true for anybody who does anything kind of like on a long-term basis, like a radio show or music. It's like you can never really guess which one of your creations will hit. It makes no, you can't. Artists have the same thing. They write song after song, and then suddenly one is like, oh my gosh, you're a genius. It's like, I've been writing songs for 20 years, where have you been? Whatever. And even movies are the same thing. I mean, I would say that if there was a person who had this unique, magical, genie-like ability to actually point to the ones that were going to succeed, you'd be a billionaire. Because Hollywood, they don't know which ones are going to work. Book publishers don't know which books are going to take off.
Keep creating.
You have to just kind of keep doing it again and again and again and again.
And for people that haven't read the article, if you had to summarize it in 3 quick points, what would you say is the 1,000 True Fans? And then also, do you have anything to add to it in the last 5 years?
So the basic thing is a very simple premise, which is that technology allows us to have someone who's a creator, and that could be a writer, a filmmaker, musician, a sculptor, photographer, anybody who's creating something. The technology allows us to actually interact with our customers directly. In the past, you needed, you'd sell a book, and there'd be a publisher and a bookseller, and someone would buy your book, but you'd have no connection as the author with that person. But now you can sell a book, even if you don't sell them directly. They can have an email. They can contact you on an ongoing basis. And so the premise is simply that if you have that kind of ability to connect with your audience directly, and you don't have all these other people involved with publishers and music studios and everybody, if you're actually creating and dealing directly with them, that the numbers that you need to actually get a living are very small. And I call those people that are going to be most valuable to you true fans, because the true fans are fans that will purchase anything that you produce in on all the varieties, all the different editions, all the different venues, whatever it is, anything you do, they're going to support you in it. If you don't need very many of those kinds of people, and by my calculation, for a single creator, you need about 1,000. If you can produce $100 worth of goods a year, then 100 times 1,000 is $100,000. That's a living, okay? And so that's the basic idea. Now, you have to adjust that by lots of different things, because you have expenses you have to subtract. If you have more than one person as a duo, you have to multiply by 2. And the important thing, though, is that number is actually not critical. It's the order of magnitude. It says you don't need 1 million fans to make a living if you have direct contact with them. You don't need even 100,000. You need it in the thousands. And the second thing about that I would say is that that's not for everybody, because there's a lot of work involved in dealing with your fans. There's a lot of work in connecting with them and servicing them directly. And not everybody wants that. Some authors or artists, they don't want to become a social media guy or a person or a girl. They want to paint in their studio. And so for them, they need to have somebody involved. So you have to add a layer, and you have to adjust those numbers in some capacity. So it's not for everybody, but it's a possibility. And even if you have help, you're still in that order of magnitude. What have I learned since then? I think there are it's a viable goal. It's still a tough way to, it still takes a lot of work to get there without the help of people from outside. You're kind of a good example of somebody who's doing that. Most of the people who started doing it came from the Hollywood studios or the music labels or book publishers, and then decided to take their kind of existing audience and let go of that and go to it directly. There's fewer people who rise from the bottom, but there are enough now that I know for certain that this works. You know, Hugh Howey, who's a science fiction author, started with Amazon Kindle, and he became a best-selling author, and he still has people publishing his book, but he's still basically a true fan, thousand true fan person from the beginning. He still starts by selling his stuff to the customers directly first. And so there are people who can, enough examples in all the different media that we know this is possible.
Right.
And I think what we need is more role models, people to kind of become known as, well, they're doing it this way.
And I think one of the biggest points of that article is that by focusing on those 1,000 true fans, you'll find that message that resonates,
Right.
as opposed to trying to please a million people.
Exactly.
And then if you can resonate with those 1,000, then that will scale.
Right.
And yeah, it's something we think about around here all the time. You know, we have, funny enough, an academy that's at around 1,000 right now.
There you
and
go.
so, you know, we just constantly service those people. And yes, it's actually very difficult.
Right,
you have
right.
to deal with people. You have to keep them happy. But it also keeps you on that cutting
Exactly.
edge of knowing what's going on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That direct contact makes you honest and makes you really focus on delivering value versus just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah. Just want to wrap up with Wired. When you look back on that Wired experience, how do you remember it? And do you remember of, you know, we did X, and then like what was that biggest challenge when you were there? Or even today with the magazine?
Well, you know, like a lot of things that became successful, they look extremely obvious in retrospect. But you can talk to anybody, every single person who became successful, and it was not obvious to anybody going in. And so it was against all odds. It was, I mean, Wired had probably at least 3 or 4 complete near-death experiences where we were like inches from just going under. And that's, again, very typical for a lot of successes that seem, again, inevitable from the hindsight. And so,
So in the 90s, probably.
yeah, so I remember the fact that it was very unlikely to succeed. We had a lot of doubters constantly. We were rejected all the time. And we were kind of always kind of pushing that, trying to show that this was going to work. I mean, the basic thing that Wired did was to show, or I should say, to move technology from the margins into the center. Say, this is the main event. This is the main story. This is what's going to be driving the next decades. And we kind of took the nerds and made them heroes. Okay, so that's the main thing we did was to talk to, there's a lifestyle around this. This is no longer fringe bedroom teenager pimply guys talking to each other on the bulletin boards. No, this is bigger than that. So I think the main thing we did was to convince people that this was the main event.
Okay. When did you leave that, and
so,
do you miss it?
The saga is that Wired was the founders who owned most of the stock. We lost control of the company during the height of the dot-com boom and bust, when the VCs wanted to sell at the peak, and we wanted to go for long term, and we had an IPO that was being shepherded by Goldman Sachs that failed.
Because of the drop, or around there? Okay,
Right
so
before.
01, and it was happening, and okay.
Well, actually, it was before that. It was 2000, and we had a profitable magazine, and we had naturally an unprofitable digital side. But we invented the click-through ad banner. We had the first digital magazine that had advertising.
Wow.
We had a search engine.
Wow.
We would have done what Google did, which was to do the ad auction. That's where we were headed to. But So the digital side was valued at this crazy internet valuation, and the revenue producing magazine was dismissed entirely. So they divided it. When the IPO failed, we missed some benchmarks. The VCs took over board seats. They decided to sell the company against our wishes. They divided the company. They sold the magazine to Condé Nast, and they sold the digital side, which was worth all the money, to Lycos, who completely squandered it. And there was a prohibition, so the magazine couldn't have Wired.com.
Okay. So it all ended, okay.
So anyway, so I was like, so Cy Newhouse, Condé Nast, bought the magazine, and I have to say that of all the places that Wired could have been sold to, it was the best thing for the magazine because they just gave it money and left it where it was. But I had no interest in working for a billionaire. So I left shortly after that. And because it was really fun when we were making our own magazines, doing crazy stuff, taking risks, because we had one thing, which was we made the magazine for ourselves. We were making the magazine we wanted to read. And one of the injunctions I gave to the writers who were writing for me, like if you work for a newspaper, they have these kind of guidelines that, okay, you're writing for the 11th grader, or you're writing for your mom or something. And so I had one piece of advice for all the writers who wrote. I said, here's who you're writing for. You're writing for me and only me. And I have read everything, and I am totally bored. You have to amaze me.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
What is something you believe that others think are crazy?
Master something, and your passion will follow that.